Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today in the rain. My name is Patrick Doherty, and I direct the Smart Strategy program here at the New America Foundation. Today, we're thrilled to host the Washington launch of McKinsey Global Institute's latest report, Urban World, Mapping the Power of Cities. You can see the graphic there, and here's the report. I hope everyone's picked one up out front, and if you're watching online, either live or webcast or recorded, you can pick it up at www.mckinsey.com/MGI. Before I introduce our speakers, Richard and Jana, however, I'd like to take a moment to share with you why this kind of research, I think, is so critically important for policymakers. As the report notes, more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and those cities produce 80% of global GDP. That alone is reason enough to justify this close study. But perhaps more important, this study, especially when examined in alongside two of McKinsey's previous reports on urbanization trends in China and India, outlines what I think is the major strategic question facing Washington in the coming decades of the 21st century. How do we ensure that global urbanization is economically, politically, and ecologically sustainable? And perhaps more important than that, how can Washington turn this era into an opportunity for increased prosperity and security here at home? 675 million people will be leaving the villages of India and China over the next 20 years and entering the cities. This is alone the biggest urban migration the world has ever seen. It is extremely disruptive to everything from social relations to business models, to supply chains and the environment. This process will decide the relations of the world's great superpowers. Here in the US, we're facing a major demographic shift. Baby boomers and millennials no longer aspire to live in car-dependent suburbs, with 60% of the population preferring a more walkable, urban, and greener lifestyle. And my co-author on a recent article, who's the master of this piece of literature and research, Chris Lineberger, is here with us in the audience. Thanks for coming, Chris. And on top of wanting that more walkable urban lifestyle, we'll be adding 130 million people to our own population over the next 40 years. Southern California will add 6 million in the next 20. Utah will double its population in the same period. And according to this report, 98 of the top 600 cities will be in North America. As someone who used to live in Rome and now lives in Washington, I understand that societies can fail to rise to the great strategic challenges of the day. Right now, I fear, neither Washington, Beijing, nor New Delhi is on a trajectory to meet this challenge. By collecting this data and making the business case for urbanization, hopefully sustainable urbanization, McKinsey is helping to nudge all of us into a brighter future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard and Jana. Richard Dobbs is the lead author of this report, along with Jana and their colleague Sven Smith. Richard is the director of McKinsey Global Institute and a director, senior partner of McKinsey, and is based in Seoul. From 2004 to 2009, Richard co-led McKinsey's corporate finance practice, where he was also responsible for research and development. And as you can imagine, he wrote a lot in that position about the financial crisis. Richard holds an MBA from Stanford and a BA from Oxford University. Jana is a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute based in San Francisco. Since 2003, she's led MGI research on productivity and competitiveness. Jana was previously a McKinsey consultant in San Francisco and Mexico, working with high-tech clients on strategy-related topics. Jana has a PhD in applied economics from Stanford University and a master's in economics and philosophy from the University of Helsinki, Finland. As we're getting ready for the presentation, a little housekeeping. If anyone can take a moment to turn off your phones, that would be very helpful. And after the presentation, we'll have a short on-stage discussion and then open it up to questions from the floor. Thank you both for coming today. I'd also like to thank, before we start, Lenny Mendonça, who is one of the great titles of business, Director of Firm Knowledge at McKinsey. Lenny's been a great supporter of our work here at New America, and he's made today's event possible. And now I'll turn to Richard to start us off.
I think when we look at the history of this period in the global economic evolution of the world, the financial crisis that we've just had will be part of it, but actually the financial crisis will be a very small part of the point we're living through, because we're going through a fundamental transition in terms of the world economy. The last 30, 50, 100 years have actually been remarkably easy for the global economy. We've had a huge tailwind, or a series of tailwinds, if you can have more than one tailwind. We've had demographics, generally in most parts of the world, helping. We've had falling, over the last 30 years, cost of capital has been progressively falling. Over the last 100 years, the cost of commodities has been declining. And over the last sort of 15, 20 years, we've had the addition to the global labor force of 100 million or so workers on the east coast of China, plus others through trade, that has also brought down the cost of labor, which has allowed a lot of growth. So when you put that all together, it's actually been pretty good for the global economy. And we think the bad news going forward in much of the world is that these tailwinds are going to become headwinds. We're seeing the end of the demographic dividends in most countries, with the exception of countries like India, and I think India has another challenge of how to create 200 million new jobs. We're going to see, because of the urbanization, I'll come back and talk about that later, we're going to see the end of cheap capital. The required investment going on in Asia, in emerging markets, is going to make capital more expensive. It's going to make commodities more expensive unless we get a step change in productivity. So we're going to see a number of factors making growth much harder to do. The only good news for the world economy, and it's mixed in some ways, is urbanization. There is an industrial revolution happening in China, to some extent in India, other emerging markets. And that industrial revolution is going to result in a step change in economic power in those countries. Now, it's going to have a secondary effect. For some parts of the world, it's actually bad news. If you are a borrower in the US, even if you're not going to have a threat of your job disappearing because of what's going on in India and China, you're going to find capital will be more expensive, so you're going to get hit by that. If you're someone who consumes large amounts of commodities, again, you're going to be hit by commodity prices being high. So the Asian effect, or the urbanization effect, goes beyond the building of cities. Now, we think at McKinsey Global Institute, understanding what is going on urbanization is therefore a core part of understanding what the next 30 years of the global economy. We slightly cheat. We don't do short-term forecasts. Some people unfairly say that we don't do short-term forecasts because if you do long-term forecasts, by the time you're proved wrong, you've moved on to do something else. Actually, the reason we tend to do long-term forecasts is that actually the types of strategies that governments and companies need to make are around what's driving the long term. Really, it doesn't matter what happens next quarter in most cases. In fact, next quarter is very hard to forecast because it's about behaviors, and behaviors are very difficult to predict. Who knows what's going to happen on the QE2 program at the end of June here, for instance. But when you look over 30 years, those things are actually much easier to predict. So you have this slight paradox that it's easier to forecast the longer term than it is necessarily the shorter term. So we're going to present today some views about how the world economy might evolve in terms of urbanization, in terms of the urban world. But if we could just start by putting what's going on in context, and sometimes we get a bit short term when we look at analysis. We tend to look in rather a short period. So we're going to start here with a slightly longer term view of the world economy. Sorry, that's here. If we put this in the context, and this is Angus Madison's data, of the last 2,000 years, and actually understand the world economy was relatively stable for the first 1,500 years. India and China together represented about 50% of the world economy. The United States, North America was pretty small. Europe was the majority of the rest of it. And then the Industrial Revolution happened. And as you can see, the Industrial Revolution starting in 1750, 1800, depending on how you measure it, resulted in India and China becoming together less than 10% of global GDP. What we are seeing now is the Industrial Revolution happening in India and China. It's just happening 250 years later than it happened elsewhere. And for those people who don't believe this is going to happen, this is a very helpful chart. And there are still a lot of people who believe that somehow this is not going to happen. this is not about something new happening in Asia. This is about Asia just going back to where Asia was 250 years ago. And just a reminder of the economics. And these are numbers based on the work we did in India and China. If you look at the typical GDP per capita, in an urban setting, people earn about 3 times as much. You get a benefit of scale, you get the benefit of agglomeration, and allowing people to have a higher level of income, working in a type of work you would do in a city rather than in an urban setting. And it somewhat depends on the size of that. But it's also much cheaper to deliver basic services in an urban setting. So this chart on the right shows some example of what it takes to deliver roads, what it takes to deliver water. And you can see there's a 30 to 50% advantage trying to deliver it into a higher concentration area. And this is true of education, this is true of all those services. And in many cases, it's not just cheaper to do it, it's actually possible to do it. Some of the places in India, they just can't get the rural thing. It's not a matter of just money. It's just the infrastructure is just not there to be able to put in education, some of this stuff. So because of that, it's easier to deliver these services in cities. So people in cities, the next generation people in cities, grow up better educated, they grow up more healthy, and they grow up with a better opportunity. So the effect that we're seeing one-off when you take someone from subsistence farming and put them in a factory happens to the next generation because the next generation grows up more healthy. So that's the sort of the context. And you can see another way of looking at this in terms of the history of a number of countries in their urbanization program. On the horizontal axis here, we have the urbanization rate, the percentage of people who live in cities. Vertical axis is the GDP per capita. And you can see there's sort of this upward trend in both of them, and obviously correlation doesn't imply causation, but given the numbers on the previous page, you can see why that might happen. And you can see countries like South Korea with a very, very rapid urbanization over less than 45 years of going from 25% to somewhere like 80%, and how that also helped bring up income. So this is the trend we're on. If you think about what China's doing, the model they look at is South Korea. They spend quite a lot of time understanding the Korean model and what are the lessons from that, and Korea obviously spent time understanding the Japanese model and basing it from that as well. And there's a sort of path there. And China is going to be just trying to do what Korea did, but just 20 times the size. So that order anyway. So that's the sort of the context. Now, when we started off this work to try and understand the shape of global urbanization, we had a sort of number of actually core beliefs. Now, as you probably guess, we're going to show most of these core beliefs are wrong, so we're calling them the urbanization legends. First of all, we thought this was about megacities. I mean, I did some consulting work 10 years ago thinking about footprint, and the real conversation was where are the megacities and how we can do that. Megacities do matter. They influence culture, they influence a lot of decision making, but in terms of megacities, as we'll come over, megacities are a lot less important in driving economic growth. The second belief is that when you look at cities in the urbanization, it's actually about population growth. It's population growth that drives it. Now, actually, what we find is that population growth is part of the reason growth happens, but you're also getting income per head growth. And income per head growth is actually a much bigger driver of economic growth than population growth because of the effects I described earlier on. The third area is that there's a belief that, BRICS is what matters. Actually, we'll find that BRICS is important, the BRICS countries, particularly China, but actually there are a lot of other cities that are as important. The next urban belief that, again, we started off thinking is that aging was a developed world story. You see, and a number of you know, in China has actually as big an aging problem as almost any other country. And then finally, when you look at the middle income and the higher income categories, there's a belief that perhaps that was not something in developed world. That is not the case. Anyone who's been to a luxury market, luxury store in China, or actually in Korea, because the Chinese prefer to come and buy in Korea because they think that even in the Louis Vuitton shop in China, they're getting a fake. So you come there. There is about a 10-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute queue to get into the Louis Vuitton shop in Korea. And that's Koreans, but it's also the Chinese. So luxury is a big part of this. So those are the myths. Jana is going to take through the analysis on what we see as the urban world. I think the one thing we want to be very clear on is the projections we're going to put together, take you through. The one thing we can say with certainty about these projections is they're wrong. To try and forecast what's going on in the future, it's a scenario. But it's a scenario that gives you a shape. And it may be directionally correct. We hope it's directionally correct. But when you get through the analysis, the question is, if this is to happen, if this is the direction of the world going, how much are the policy decisions going on? How wrong are they? How much do they need to change? How much do decisions about how to operate businesses and think about business footprints they need to change? So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jana, who's going to take you through the analysis we've done on the urban world.
So it is my task to show you that some of the legends that we started with are actually not exactly what we saw on the data. So what I will do is that I'll give you a quick highlight of the top line story, and I'll give you three kinds of learnings that we take. First, just on the overall pattern of global growth and what's the role of cities. So I'll talk a little bit about the concentration, the regional cut on the city growth in the world. Then I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of changes in demographics and income groups that we expect to see in the cities in the world, and including some of the changes that we see when we compare them across the different kinds of regions, and take a US cut as well to see how does US urban growth compare with the rest. And at the end then, I will invite Richard to come back and talk a little bit of what we think this scenario means for organizations of different kinds, or what kind of questions does it raise. So first, when you are looking at the urban growth, we are seeing quite a big change in the regional weighting. Today, the global economy is really still a lot about the developed countries. On the left-hand side, we have the global GDP in 2007 divided by region. So 70% of global GDP is still coming of developed countries. Developing country megacities at another 3%. So really today, global economic weight is heavily on the Western world. When you take a different look and look at how global economy is going to grow in the next 15 years, which is the chart on the right, the story is quite different. The contribution of developed economies to global growth is going to be roughly a quarter of overall. Megacities is going to be another 8%, the developing world megacities. And megacities, by the way, are the cities with 10 million or more inhabitants today. So these are the big cities that a lot of the city debate has been focusing on, and there's 23 of them today in the world. But even together, these megacities in emerging markets and developed countries, they will contribute roughly a third of global growth. What is missing really is the middleweight cities, which are cities between 150,000 and 10 million across the developing world. They will bring, we expect, more than the third of growth in the world. And of course, for most people thinking about the evolving shape of the global economy, the challenge is that many of these middleweight cities are not household names. In China, India, emerging markets, there's a lot of cities that may have 4 million, 5 million people that we have never heard of. And that really is one of the big challenges that we hope that our work can help shed light into. The good news, however, when you are thinking of the world as it's evolving, is that it is more concentrated than we expected. What we have done here is that we have taken the cities that we have in our database and ranked them by their contribution to global growth on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we have the cumulative contribution of the number of cities, of the top cities, of a certain amount. So for example, if you take the top 100 cities in the world, ranked by their absolute contribution to global growth, they will contribute roughly 35% of the expected growth. When you move from the top 100 of the city 100, as we call them, to the top 600 cities, the city 600, they will contribute over 60% of growth. And this actually is a group of dynamic cities across the globe that we are really focusing on, because in a way, if there's 600 cities that will generate 60% of global growth, they're actually probably cities worth knowing, and we'll talk quite a bit about them. When you move beyond the next 400 cities, then from number 600 to 1,000 will another 6%. So in a way, the 600 top cities are really a lot of where the story is. And these cities are really distributed across the globe. What we have here is both the broader database in the light blue, but if you focus on the darker blue dots on the City 600, they are very heavily in North America. There's lots of American cities, very heavily in China, and then distributed more evenly in India, Western Europe, and across the different parts of the emerging market. But it really is a global database of cities, and it includes cities that have populations from 150,000 in the developed world to over 150,000 in the developed world and over 200,000 in the developing one, and from there up front. So while we'll talk a lot about the City 600 because of the fact that they are so dynamic and they contribute so much to growth, this is actually not the only cut one can take to thinking about cities. So for example, we have here the top 25 cities ranked by different criteria. So the third column, GDP growth, is the top 25 cities in our City 600. These are the top 25 cities by their contribution to growth. But it may be that this is not the kind of cities you are interested in. Perhaps you are targeting the middle class in the world, so you might want to be looking at the last column, which is cities ranked by their number of households with income over 20,000 in 2025. So if you're looking to be where the middle class is going to be in 15 years, these would be the top 25 cities. And it's actually going to be quite a different rank. For example, I don't know how many of you would have guessed that Mexico City, Moscow, and Sao Paulo will all have more folks in this income group than Los Angeles would, because 20,000 at purchasing power is still, it is middle class, but it is not the lower middle class, where a lot of the emerging market middle class real growth is coming from. But let's spend some time on the City 600, which is the third column in here, and the following 575 cities from there, and see what do we learn when we start looking at them and the growth. First of all, when you break down the contribution of these cities by different population size, megacities will contribute a significant share. The 23 cities will contribute about 12% of global growth. However, it is below their current share in global GDP, which is 14. So in a way, they will actually pull less than their weight to the growth overall. And this is not a new phenomenon. Most or many of the megacities already have not been growing in the last 15 years as fast as their national economies. So in a way, this is not really a radical change. It was just something that we weren't really aware of, given that the focus has been a lot on the megacities. Instead, it really is the middleweights that contribute 50% of global growth. And there's going to be another 40% that will come from the rural areas, etc. But that is where still a larger share of the global population will be. These cities represent only about a quarter or slightly less than that of global population. So how is this growth distributed by region? Unsurprisingly, most of the growth is going to come from emerging economies. The roughly 420 cities there will contribute 45% of the global growth. China is clearly a big part of the story. 220 of the cities in our database are in China. There's 10 more that are from Taiwan, etc. In that number. And collectively, they will contribute almost 30% to global growth. And this really is a function of both rapid urbanization and movement of people as well as GDP growth. In contrast, India, which we often think as the other parallel, will contribute 1/10, or the Indian cities will contribute 1/10 of Chinese growth. There's only roughly 30 plus cities in the largest growth contributors from India, and their expected contribution to global growth is going to be about 3%. However, it is not just a developing world story. There is about 100 cities in North America, almost all of them in the United States, that will contribute 10%. So the US really is, after China, the biggest contributor to global urban growth in the world. And that was actually also something that we were surprised of. It wasn't all about BRICS, as Richard had mentioned. So when we think about what is driving that rapid growth in emerging market, it really is both the population growth and GDP per capita growth. because those are the two components that by definition you can decompose growth into. And in the case of China, for example, it is the fact that not only are they getting a lot more people into the cities, but the GDP per capita in those cities is growing very rapidly. And in most cases, on average, it's something between 25 to 30%, the share of population growth contribution, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, where still population growth represents almost half of the city's overall GDP growth. So this is just a very quick snapshot of how the patterns of global growth look when you take an urban angle to that. How about if we start thinking about what is happening in these cities? What are the demographic and income changes that we expect to see? First of all, population growth in the City 600, we expect it to be roughly 60% higher than the population growth in the world. And this has something to do with the mix of cities in this in the sample, but also the migration patterns into them. So by 2025, when you look at the distribution of folks by age group, we expect the City 600 to have 25% of all the working age population folks between 15 to 64, 15% of the world's children, and 35% of the world's elderly. So in a way, the cities are going to be slightly older. The most dynamic cities are going to be slightly older than the world overall. When you look at this by region, as Richard already announced, we know that aging is not going to be just a story about developed cities. There's going to be, we expect to see more than 120 million people above 65, more than 125 more people aged 65 and above in the emerging markets, largely in China, versus only 35 million in the developed regions. These cities will contribute, we estimate, roughly 35% of the expansion of the potential workforce. And just to give an example of some of the regional differences in, let's look at the children. In the Americas, we expect the US cities in the City 600 to have more than 3 million more children in 15 years than we have today. In Latin America, in contrast, the number of kids are expected to decline by almost 10 million. And in many cases, the demographic patterns you see in cities don't necessarily match with what we are expecting at the national level. So in China, for example, because of the aging and the demographic structure, as a nation, we expect to have fewer children in China in 15 years than today. In the cities, we actually expect to have 7 million more. And at the same time as we are seeing these demographic changes, household structures are changing. We expect to see a decline in the average number of people per household. And that means that household growth is going to be, we estimate, 2.5 times the rate of global population growth in these cities. And this, of course, means that demand for anything that's household driven, dwellings, basic services, electricity, broadband, telecommunications that are fixed, in a way, all of those demands are actually in the cities expanding much faster than we would expect just by looking at population growth. And this, of course, has a lot of implications for policymakers as well as suppliers for these goods and services. And just to give you an example of the numbers, what we have here is a few cities from Latin America where we have looked at the household-driven demand for dwellings. So, for example, in Sao Paulo, we expect that in the next 15 years, there will be 4 million more new dwellings needed, simply because of the population growth and the change in the demographic structure. And this growth is obviously much faster than you would expect if you just look at Brazilian population growth. And in some cities, the expansion can be even much more significant. In Bogotá, for example, even though it starts from a lower level, the expansion or the increasing demand for dwellings is expected to almost double in the next 15 years. And this is not just a story of volume of demand increase. It also means that the kinds of dwellings people are looking for are different, because the households are going to be smaller, they're going to be older, they're going to be richer. So in a way, there's going to be a lot of adjustment and pressures on the city infrastructures as a result. So then last to the question which interests a lot of people, which is income distribution and what are we expecting on the cities. We expect to have very rapid expansion, if you want, in the higher end of the middle class in the City 600 in the world, particularly on the developing cities. And just to give you an idea of the numbers, on the left-hand side of the chart, we have the number of households broken down by their income groups. So the struggling, the light blue there, for example, is people who earn $7,500 US at purchasing power. So households that earn $7,500 US at purchasing power a year. The aspiring group, the income bracket is $7,500 to $20,000. For consuming, it is $20,000 to $70,000, and global then is households that earn over $70,000 per year. And today, developed cities have roughly twice as many households among the City 600 than do developing ones in the relatively higher income segment of over 20,000. So the consuming and global segments together. This will change in the next 15 years. When we move forward, we expect there to be 235 households in this income segment in the emerging market cities. And that's going to be actually higher than we expect to see in the developed ones. So clearly, the upper middle class story is no longer only about the developed world either. So these characteristics are kind of a global cut on the story. How oftentimes you can't really take the global picture and apply it to any region because there is very large differences across the regions. And our work actually started in deep dives and looking at China and India, as Patrick indicated earlier. And one of the things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the urban evolution are those differences. And just to give you one example between India and China that we all already alluded to. In India today, there are only 177 cities that have a population of 200,000 or more. In China, we have 600 of them. So in a way, the state of urbanization is already quite different between the two regions. India is at the much earlier stage, if you want, than China. And as a result, when you look at the contributions of the cities to growth, in India, 60% of growth is still going to come from small towns and rural areas. So in a way, story is much different in India than in China, where not at the highest level we'll see very rapid expansion of megacities, which is what we expect to see. We'll actually expect to see 7 new megacities in China alone. But the story really is about the 50% of the mid-tier cities, if you want, even the smaller cities in the Cityscope database between 200,000 and 2 million inhabitants, where really 50% of Chinese growth is going to come from. That means that rural areas will contribute less than 10%. So that's a very big difference. And when you see similar differences between US and Western Europe. For example, US much more concentrated on cities on the coast versus in Western Europe, it is more fragmented beyond London and Paris. It's more fragmented across smaller cities throughout the region. Let's look at what's happening in the US, and instead of bringing out projections going forward, let's look at some of the recent past in US city contribution and see how different are the patterns that we have seen in the US relative to what do we expect to see in the world going forward. First of all, US economic activity is actually quite concentrated as well, so it's not very different from the global story. Top 20 cities have accounted for 40% of GDP, and actually 50% of productivity growth, which has been the big driver of growth for the US. And clearly, as you can see of the ranking, after New York and Los Angeles, the 2 megacities in here, Washington is the third contributor to productivity growth, much more than that its share of GDP would indicate. So it is concentrated. In addition, when you look at the megacities contribution, which is only Los Angeles and New York, they'll contribute roughly 10%, not very different from the share globally. And it really has been the mid-sized cities that have contributed 60% of US growth. And last, when we start looking at the individual cities, and this again is very much it's a very different thing to project in the future. There is a lot of changes in individual city performances depending on many things, their sector structure, their governance, etc. So we're looking backward on the US cities, I think teaches us more than trying to predict what's going to happen with individual cities. But since 1990, this is a very busy chart with lots of US cities, and I don't want you to, it just tells you that the experiences of individual cities have been spread out quite broadly. But I think what is interesting to look at here is the real success stories. The cities that have grown in population and in GDP per capita above the US average rate, which is the top quadrant in here. And what do we see? We have clear success stories of the middleweight cities, if you want, largely in the south and west. You have Phoenix there, a lot of the cities that have benefited from the baby boomer move towards the Sun Belt. We have Austin, Boise, Idaho, and Portland, Oregon. Typical mid-sized cities that have been really able to attract population that is often well educated. They're good places to live with reasonable housing costs and fewer traffic challenges than some of the larger cities. And in many cases, for example, on the West Coast, high-tech companies have put their locations there because they're good places for people to live and they are attractive locations. So a very quick look at the US story. It's actually, I mean, this was another one that was a real surprise for us, which is when you look at even the US in the recent past, the global projections going forward are not that different. In a way, that's the pattern, which makes us think that, as Richard said, directionally, we think this probably is not that badly off. So let me then turn back to you, Richard, and think a little bit of what this might mean.
So we've all lived in a world where really focusing on developed world cities plus the megacities in emerging markets has made sense. You know, it's 73% of world economic growth. It's where ideas happen. It's where innovation happens. It's where the talent traditionally has gone. And that's been the historic mindset. But as we've seen in the US, that's already breaking down, that people are beginning to go to second-tier cities, and that's been less, the megacities have been less important. We think going forward, companies and policymakers need to actually change the mindset of how they think about their approach to cities, to think about the middleweight cities in emerging markets in particular. And so we've just got some examples. If you're a global consumer business, is your portfolio positioned against where the urban opportunity is? What are the largest urban growth areas? And if you look at some of the successful ones, like Yum Brands, for instance, the Kentucky Fried Chicken business, if you look at their teams in China, they don't have a team just in Shanghai. They have a team in every province working on, or every province apart from Tibet, I think, working on developing their position there. So they've got out there, they've got connected. And that's part of the challenge is companies need to sort of move away from the megacities and understand that. If you're looking at as an infrastructure supplier, where are the cities that are actually going to be requiring all the growth? Where's that going to be? And again, you need to be able to position yourself to sell into those different cities. Now, this is going to actually change the game, because if you're selling into countries, it's actually relatively easy to do it as a small business. You only have to have a sales team in Beijing, or you have to have one in Mumbai. But if you're actually saying, well, what really matters is what's going on in Wuhan, you need to have a sales team in Wuhan. Now, if you're a company like GE with the ability to have a sales team that spans across multiple businesses, you potentially have a source of advantage than a smaller competitor only in one of their businesses. So the nature of economic power, the nature of economies of scale could fundamentally change on this, giving larger companies or companies that have multiple businesses potentially a source of advantage. And then I think the other area that's going to be important is that we're going to see an increase in the importance of the mayor as a person in governance. If a lot of growth is coming from the mid-tier cities, and if we're worried about how we get sustainability to happen in terms of the economic growth, central government matters, but the mayor matters too. The mayor of a city is the person who actually does the sustainability plan, often at the city level. So we're going to see an increasing importance of that level of global governance. And obviously there are some countries like India that don't have a proper mayor system. Egypt doesn't have a proper mayor system. Other countries where the mayor covers a small part, but the city has sprawled out beyond the mayor's area. So the mayor is the wrong person to do that. But we can see in some of the countries that are very heavily urbanized, like Korea, for instance, the Korean president at the moment, like the Russian historically, the Korean president is a former mayor of Seoul. So it's often a politically important role in terms of that. But there's sort of a couple of other thoughts on this. First of all, in terms of the rebalancing, this is not just about companies. This is also about State Departments and things like that. Now, the US State Department publishes their phone list. So you can actually do the calculation on this. The US State Department have 10 people in Auckland, not capital city of New Zealand. They have one person in Wuhan in China. Now, Wuhan in China is going to grow GDP-wise over the next 20 years, about 10 times the amount of Auckland. But the people are the other way around. So governments need to start thinking about how you're going to support businesses. And again, we're going to see economies of scale coming in there. Because the US government can afford to put someone in Wuhan. You can put someone in Chongqing because you're a bigger country. The EU can afford to put someone if the EU operated at the EU level. But if you're Portugal or Spain or Denmark, it's much, much harder to do that, or Singapore. You know, it's very hard for them to put someone in one of those cities in a way that obviously the US potentially could, and the EU, if the EU could operate at the EU level. So again, we're going to see economies of scale, economies of scope becoming more important and the game changing. And I think for American State Department and American companies, which often have a scale and a scope advantage, this actually could be a major source of advantage going forward. So that's some thoughts on how the world might change in terms of how we need to do things differently. We're only beginning to get our head around some of this stuff. The purpose of the research was to give a direction, provide challenge for how companies think about their footprint, how governments need to think about approaching some. The other component, just closing thought, is that cities have always been very important in terms of setting policies, setting ideas. As we think about this type of change, I think the interesting challenge is going to be whether the megacities are going to lose out on that too. At the moment, the places that still influence ideas, thinking, innovation, attract talent, historically have been the megacities. And I think what the US is a very interesting example of this, back to the point Jana made. Companies are now moving away from the megacities. We're not seeing that in terms of talent elsewhere in the world. It's still the best Chinese still want to go to the big city. And you see that in India as well. I think the question is whether the US experience on this is going to be something that happens elsewhere, and whether we're going to see over time Chinese people wanting to go to the second-tier cities in the same way as our companies are setting up in Austin and setting up in Portland there. And if that happens, that could also be an interesting area in terms of how the policy making evolves. So thank you very much for allowing us to launch this report in Washington at this your foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jana. This is really a great tour de force and eye-opening. And Jana, I did love that chart on the U.S. With the bubbles. That was great to see. It's going to be very useful going forward. You know, I think you tell, as you mentioned, Richard, in your remarks, this is a projection, and you're probably wrong. But I think it does set a general. It is giving us a general trajectory of where we're heading in a business as usual case. And you talk about where we're heading. Could you talk about the obstacles to getting there, some of the other ones? I mean, you talked about governance and the role of the mayor and really needing good mayors out there. You know, at least in the American context, good mayors are only as good as their jurisdictional boundaries, right? Because right now the mayor of D.C. can't deal with metropolitan Washington, which I'm sure is what you measured on that chart. Mayor Bloomberg has an easier time of it. But so there's the governance challenge. What are the other challenges? I mean, and to kind of lead the question here, in the India and China reports, you looked at water, resources, and some other resource issues. Could you talk about some of the real obstacles to this coming up? And Jana, please, both of you chime in.
I think there's going to be two or three fundamental challenges. There's the issue of governance, as you say, you know, how you manage cities. And that's where the mayor is important. I mean, the two countries that don't have proper mayors are Egypt and India. And you go to Cairo and you just look at how the mess it, and you go to India and look at the mess of cities. You know, it's hard to sort of, you know, I didn't quite understand this to begin with, but then you look at how a proper jurisdiction mayor, and there is absolutely that issue, can address that. Yeah. The second area is actually about education. And I think this is where the India-China comparison comes in quite well. China, this is Dick Cooper at Harvard has this analogy that China made a decision in the 50s to go for rural education. at the same time as India made a decision to go for higher education. So you go to any faculty around the world, you will find a significant number of people in any faculty, not a number of people who have come out of the Indian IITs. So they produced postgraduates around the world. China has many fewer because they have less investment in that. But they have a group of people. If you go to a Chinese village, however obscure it is, and you get up early in the morning, you see the school children in their uniforms going to school, where they get there on time, they sit at their desks, and they work, and they do their sort of work, they do repetitive tasks or whatever, and they're used to the discipline, and they turn up on time every day. So you can take someone out of a Chinese rural setting and move them into a urban job, and they'll turn up every day on time, and they'll do a repetitive task. They're ideal factory workers on that. The problem with India is that you take someone out of an Indian rural setting and you try and move them to a city, they just don't turn up the next day. So if I talk to sort of the companies in Asia that are looking at where they relocate, they'll put their plants in Vietnam, they'll put them in China, they'll put them in Bangladesh. They say India, only for the domestic market, if they're really being honest on this. So I think there's an educational challenge of how you get education to happen such that you're able to successfully migrate people to the city.
Right, that's not the normal educational challenge that we think of. We think about innovation and high tech and
absolutely.
Right, that's not the normal one.
But this is basic disciplines.
And then you're at this stage of the Industrial Revolution, that's what you're talking about.
And then the third one is just getting the infrastructure to happen. Yeah. If India, for instance, needs to build roads, sewage systems, water systems, about 10 times faster than they have, or 10 times more volume than they have over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So they've got to get that step change increase in that. We've got to find a way, as the 900 or billion middle class people come, that they will consume energy. They will want cars that we can do it without killing the environment. Right. So the way that the whole infrastructure works. So I think the three challenges are, education in terms of the basic education, such that you can urbanize people successfully. Secondly, the governance, so you can manage the whole thing, and thirdly, how you put the infrastructure in place.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Can I add a fourth one? And I think this is right up your alley, which is financing challenge. In a way, the infrastructure built on the biggest cities, in many cases, exists there. How well it works it varies by city, and it's probably not perfect anywhere. But really, the big challenge is in these rapidly growing mid-sized cities. And in many cases, the governance challenge for mayors is combined with the fact that they really have no reliable financing mechanisms. Mm-hmm. It varies very widely across the different regions. So, for example, even within Latin America, the way cities finance their operations vary radically. How much they can retain if there's some sales taxes, for example. How much is just really waiting to see how much the federal government is willing to give you. Particularly a challenge if the mayors are potential candidates on the national politics later on. So those are real challenges, and in most cases you don't have the kind of bond option as you have in the US. So it really is a financing and capital challenge. But I would like to think that there is also an opportunity. Just like I think in the US story, we can see that for the mid-sized cities where you have a visionary mayor who can do things right, you actually have a capacity to create cities that can be attractive simply because they are better run and things work there. And I think there's, again, examples across the globe in Latin America, Curitiba, Medellin, very interesting innovations happening on the mid-sized cities, of which we don't hear a lot, but the local folks do know about them, and they can be attractive places for businesses.
Great. One more follow-up, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So finance is extraordinarily important, especially here in the United States, and Chris has been looking at this, and how do you innovate in that space, and it couldn't agree with you more. You also talked about kind of the resource problem, and that for Americans going forward, you're going to have these two problems of credit availability, or credit cost really, and resource availability, credit resource cost. When you look at kind of the financial trends, and you look at the resource productivity trends, and you compare it to what we're talking about here with the urban world, how are we doing? What's our resource productivity kind of bump that we need? Financial kind of availability, financial resources.
And there's
off the top of your head.
There is a linkage between them, because one of the things that we find as we are doing some research at the moment on resources is there's a linkage between the different resources. You can decide to have less carbon or use less energy by putting more capital in. An offshore wind farm
Substitute.
doesn't require any oil to build, to operate.
Yeah.
However, it requires 15 times the capital per gigawatt hour than onshore gas going into a combined cycle gas. So it's a classic capital for energy. Similarly, water. There's places in the world where there's no water. You can get water, reverse desalination and things like, a reverse osmosis desalination plants. You can do that. So the challenge is actually to understand how the commodities link together. Food is another one. You grow biofuels in land, and that sort of substitutes, effectively food replaced with energy. Again, there's that trade-off, fertilizers and all that. So one of the things that we're trying to do is understand these linkages and how you optimize going forward. Our sort of very rough numbers are we're going to have a major problem in the world if we don't double the rate of productivity improvement we've seen over the last 100 years. So we've had a great situation. Productivity and access to resources has gone faster. So, despite
just to clarify, this is resource productivity,
Resource
not
productivity.
labor productivity.
This is
Yeah.
resource
This is
productivity.
resource
So if you think about it, you look at the pictures in 1850 of the great gushers. People drilled holes, oil spurted up in the thing. It was a matter of just putting it in barrels and selling it. Oil was more expensive then than it is now, in real terms. So oil has become cheaper because productivity and access has actually gone faster than that. So we've had this declining thing. And you look at the productivity, it's about 1.5% a year. We think that you would need to double that to have about 2.5, 3 if you're going to be able to get the urban industrial revolution without having ridiculous oil price spikes. Now that's the bad news. The good news is the technology we think to do this already exists. This is not about new technology. This is about being more disciplined at applying it. And it's removing lots of barriers. So, a simple example, buildings are built without the right type of insulation. Now, if you put that insulation in over the life of the building, you actually save money. But building codes don't enforce it. The construction, the consumer who buys a house has no real measure of whether it's been built properly. So part of the challenge is to sort of look at all of these initiatives that we think are out there, that are available, and say, look, how can we be more systematic at applying it?
And that seems to be a challenge of governance at a higher level than the mayor.
In some cases, some of this stuff is about country building codes. In some cases, it's also about how the city's laid out.
Yes.
So some of it's the mayor.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But just to build on that quickly, I think the scale issue is a real cost driver. In a way, one of the most constant patterns in economics, and often, and many of you probably know, in economics there are few things where you can always find the same curve, but it is when you increase the volume, the cost of producing something tends to decline, and particularly new technologies like alternative energy, really getting the volumes up so we get down on the cost curve is a key driver of performance. And when it's done fragmented city by city is a challenge. And when you can if you can create economies of scale across cities, that can make a big difference in terms of making it economically more attractive.
Does that, getting to a conversation that Richard and I had a little bit before this event started, what does that say about the optimal scale of the economy in which can achieve those economies of scale? Can Singapore achieve that, or are we talking about something larger on the scale of the United States? And do we need to be shifting towards more, this is my hypothesis, customs unions of smaller countries or developing countries that can actually achieve that level of scale to implement this?
I think obviously there is a benefit if you get that thing, but I think that actually the scale effect is much smaller than the "are you at the efficient frontier" effect. So Singapore should really not have existed. If you think about it, Singapore, fishing village, 4 million people or whatever. Why is that a success? It's not a success because they somehow are at economic scale. It's because they're super paranoid that they're always operating at the efficient frontier. If you look at other countries like Philippines, they have more going for them in many, many dimensions, but they're not operating that way. So I think the scale effect matters, but actually whether you're on the efficient frontier versus not is an even bigger factor.
Spoken like a true economist. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Thank you guys for that exchange. And all the way in the back, if you could wait for the microphone, and if everyone could introduce yourself for the folks on the web. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Allison Johnson, and I want to thank the McKinsey Global Institute for a very interesting study. I'm a former McKinsey & Company consultant, and I am really impressed with the research that you presented this morning. But I really am here. I'm an international political economist by practice, and my concern speaks to a little bit about what you've been reviewing in terms of the environmental complications and environmental implications of your research. So I was hoping that we could dive a little bit deeper because what I've been trying to do in the environmental community is sort of link these discussions, the productivity discussions, the impacts on the climate and the environment, the discussions on urban growth versus rural growth, the impact on the environment. So if you could touch on that and how, besides the, what you're saying about increasing access to clean energy and so forth and trying to get that up to scale, what are your recommendations going to be on a policy level for the Chinas, the Indias, and even the USA to really address the fact that I remember at one point people were saying you need about 6 more planets for the rest of the world to live like Western civilization. And since NASA and others haven't found those other 6 planets, what are we going to do for the almost 7 billion people that are living here now? Thank you.
Thanks.
I mean, it's a very important question, and in fact, we are kicked off another study to look at that for exactly that reason. And this work was looking about the shape of urbanization, and we're trying to understand that. And I think the key, there's a lot of fundamental barriers that have to be addressed. I mean, this is not, though, a technology thing. There are some technologies that we can benefit from the learning curve, and if we could get more invested in it, the cost of solar would come down, the cost of wind would come down, the cost of hybrids would come down. So there's a bunch of stuff that we want to get the learning curve effect to coming through. But the real challenge is addressing sort of barriers to the fact that consumers aren't asking for this. And despite everyone saying, consumers, want to have an environmentally friendly product, when you actually do the real market research, the consumer will say, if there are 2 products, same price, one's more environmentally, I'll go for that. I'm not going to pay extra, though, for the environment. And so we've got to find a way of addressing that. And the house builders who build the houses that could be for an extra 10% more efficient don't have an incentive, because the consumers, despite the fact it may be over the life cycle cheaper, consumers aren't paying for that. So I think we've got to find ways of addressing some of these fundamental barriers to how we do that. And that's going to be, I think, the challenge. And I think in the end, the free market won't work on its own on this. We've got to get some step in terms of, putting a proper price on carbon. Companies would invest more if they had more certainty on the price of carbon. Consumers aren't necessarily to be fully relied on to make the right decision. You may want to deal with it through building codes and things like that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Chris, I know you wanted to follow up on that last point.
Chris Lineberger with Brookings and the University of Michigan. Just a quick follow-up on that, but then I want to talk about governance. The work that I've been doing, and a lot of other folks, Steve Winkleman and Peter Calthorpe and a variety of others, looking at the energy question, that much of the debate and much of the discussion that we just had was about the supply side of energy efficiency. And there is, of course, theory out there that you get more efficient and we put in a second refrigerator. And we just use more power, but it's cheaper. And we produce it with less carbon impact. But in the aggregate, we still use the same. There's the Green Manhattan theory that came out with David Owen, and now there's some recent research that basically looks at the demand mitigation side, and that urbanization dramatically decreases carbon footprint. Scott Bernstein's done some great work at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, looking at that when you move a drivable suburban household on the fringe into a walkable urban place, you're talking 60–80% decrease in carbon footprint. Big increase. So it follows the wisdom of Mr. Miyagi in the classic movie Karate Kid, when he's telling Daniel, when he was saying, how do I stop getting beat up? Best defense, no be there. And the best way to avoid energy consumption is to put yourself in a living situation where you're not going to be needing a lot of energy. Going back to governance.
I just want to follow up, and what we're seeing is there's market demand for those walkable urban neighborhoods.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where the demand is. It's not necessarily
Huge amount of
for
demand.
the more efficient vehicle or
Yeah,
appliance.
yeah.
It's for that more walkable,
Yeah.
efficient lifestyle.
Right, and the ultimate proof of that is not all the surveys that show it, which are nice, but it's the price premium that's evolved over the last 20 years, where walkable urban places are now the most expensive in most metro
Right.
areas
Yeah.
on a price per square meter basis,
That's
as
interesting.
opposed to the drivable suburban, and 20 years ago it was just the
It was the
opposite.
other way around,
And
yeah,
so the
yeah.
lines have crossed, and
Yeah.
to me, what the market's willing to pay for
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
townhouse
Yeah.
in DuPont
Yeah.
Circle, rather than a McMansion in Great Falls,
Yeah.
that's really
That's
what tells you
interesting.
what the market might. On the governance, and Patrick touched on it, is the issue of DC's a extreme example where Mayor Gray manages 10%
Yeah.
of the population of this region. Albuquerque's probably near the top, and that's about 50% for this country. So we have a major
Yeah,
governance
yeah.
issue at the metropolitan level, and Brookings spends a lot of time
Yeah.
on this. The question is, and that's just one level of governance that's missing. The other level, in my mind, is at that downtown walkable urban place level, where there's 10, 20, 30, 40 of these places that need to be managed, and we're getting
Yeah.
a nonprofit solution for that. But at that metro level, is the U.S. worse off or better off, or how do we stack up competitively compared to Western Europe, compared to India, compared to China, as far as metropolitan governance?
Yeah.
Do they have a better comprehension of the Jane Jacobs 201 theory that the metropolitan region is the building block of the economy?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think we haven't studied this globally and done the comparison. I would guess the US is somewhere in the middle. I think the people who have really got this is China. I think other countries, like many countries, struggle with the sprawl and how you change your governance. So they get it set up right, and then the city's boundary moves, and it's very hard jurisdictionally to extend the scope of the mayor. I mean, I can't, life of me, think of anyone who's recently done that, expanded the scope of a mayor. I mean, I'm sure there are examples. You may know that. I mean, the UK got rid of the mayor and then put it back. I mean, they sort of did that. But I mean, the idea of sort of suddenly saying the mayor is responsible for more. So I think that's But I would say the US is in the middle. I mean, India's a mess. So India doesn't even have mayors. So you start.
How about Western Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I had to rank, and by the way, to be very clear, we haven't done a governance assessment. It's something that I know other people have looked at, and I think it's something that we definitely are very interested in as part of our Sustainable Cities initiative, which is a big part of what many of our colleagues spent their time on. But I think when we look at benchmarks, oftentimes they come from Northern Europe, which are cities that are relatively, not the megacities necessarily, but cities where public transportation is radically different from Scandinavian countries to Germany, the Netherlands, where actually alternative things like bicycle use is significantly higher in a way. I live in a town that has one of the highest share of bicycle use in commute, which is close to 15%. It's much higher in many of the other cities. That's Davis, California, a small university town. And in addition to that, I think some of the implementation challenges are fewer because of the political structures. I'm from Finland personally, and I know that the capacity of the consensus-driven culture in Northern Europe, for example, creates much less time spent on trying to go butt heads, but more on pulling in the same direction. And that has allowed those cities, many of them, become some of the benchmarks. So Helsinki, for example, I think doesn't do particularly poorly on any of these initiatives. So when we look at benchmarks, oftentimes the ones that come up are in Northern Europe in terms of just combining the governance, the sustainability, and the economic growth. But US clearly is not. There's a lot more challenges in many of the emerging markets. Very good point on your earlier point on the more dense urban living leading to fewer energy consumption. And I think I wanted to just highlight one thing, which I think is a very important point to remember. Energy efficiency not only has the advantage that it reduces the supply challenge, it also makes huge economic sense. So because of the energy savings, actually leave more money for consumers to spend elsewhere. An economist at UC Berkeley has estimated that California's energy efficiency policies since the 1970s, that largely focusing on the demand side, have allowed per capita consumption of energy to stay flat, while the rest of the US have seen 50% increase in that growth. So this energy efficiency gain, if you want, relative to the rest of the US, has helped generate millions of jobs in California because of the energy bills are lower and the kinds of services people consume actually create more jobs than the energy sector would. So in a way there is economic evidence that not only is good for the environment, but it actually can be good for the economy.
And paying less of a Saudi Arabia tax.
I didn't go there, exactly.
Great, okay. Sir, right here in the blue shirt right there.
My name's Martin Apple. I have a question that connects. I'm trying to ask how you as economists can provide us incentives for the kinds of energy that harness the sun, solar and wind. And the reason for that is that that capacity to be produced around the world is about 2,000 exajoules, which is 5 times the world consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's really in huge excess in supply. But we don't consider that in terms of cost effectiveness for a lot of reasons. But for example, US wind power right now is cost comparable to coal, and even more so if you count in externalities, which you economists somehow feel it's okay to hide. So I'd like to put it back on the table and ask you what would be the kinds of incentives that we could use that would educate the public to create more demand.
Well, first of all, I'm not really an economist. Jana's the economist. I'm an engineer, so I had over to Jana the proper economics. But we had a session.
And both of them are working to unravel the externality problem, I think, too. So.
But I think we had a session in Seoul just before the G20 meeting where we had 120 CEOs work with some of the G20 heads of state to talk about some of the issues. And the consistent message came across was that there were a lot of companies who really felt they could accelerate the move down the learning curve effect by if they could invest more. But their real constraint was uncertainty about pricing of carbon, uncertainty of pricing investment. They would be having to make substantial investments, building wind plants or whatever, and you can see that we are moving down learning curves in terms of solar. Solar is getting cheaper. As you get more volume out there, it gets cheaper. I mean, like any other type of product. The real challenge at the moment is that there is no political clarity on the price of carbon. So if you're sitting there and you're saying, look, I could spend a substantial amount on building plants, on R&D, and all of that, it's uncertain that companies are getting the returns. So I think that they have that certainty on the way that's going to go forward. So my sense is the biggest thing that any country could do would be to have at least more certainty about the pricing of carbon going forward, because that will let the free market invest. And you always only need 5 or 10 years, because after that, the learning curve will be such that under most oil prices, I mean, unless you believe we're going to be back at $20, most of these renewable types of things will be economic because the cost will have just come down. So I think the challenge is how you bridge the next 10, 20 years. And it does seem to me, I mean, at a time where there is unemployment, at a time where capital is very cheap, as a global economy, we're rather missing an opportunity here. Why not take people who were construction workers and have them building solar farms in Nevada or whatever? I mean, I don't know if that's exactly the right way of doing it. Capital, you can borrow capital very cheaply. Shouldn't we be trying to do that now? Create the jobs, use the group of unemployed people to do something the right way, rather than sort of, but I'm afraid we're just sort of rather stuck, not just in the United States, but many countries are stuck in this political mess between governments and also within countries, between parties on this.
Yeah, I know that Google just this week announced that they've they've joined into a partnership to produce the single largest solar concentrating array I think in the Nevada desert, and they're doing it on the basis of business sense. This isn't part of Google.org. This is Google.com, and they've already figured out that even in the current climate of uncertainty, this makes good business sense. And I think as we go further down without any kind of certainty, I think it's going to become clearer and clearer.
And 120 oil, you can afford more of
exactly.
these things than
right
you
now
could
it
at
does.
60.
Yeah, and I think what the other part of your story is telling us is that $120 oil, the floor, the demand floor is pretty high. I mean, we came out to our 120 spike from 90, right?
Yeah.
It didn't come up from 30. I mean, we've got a very solid floor on energy prices.
Can I add a quick comment on that one, just taking the long-term view, because I think your point on solar is very much on. I was in a conference that combined basically Chinese and German public and private sector folks thinking about energy future. And one of the questions that was debated, what are going to be the sources of energy in 100 years? And if you wanted to guess what were the options, it was solar and fusion. And in a way, they had their sights set on that one. The question really is the short term, how do we get over the hump? And the challenges with the policies, whether it's in California or in Europe, is that they can be costly in the short term. In the long term, I think there's no doubt we will get there when the volumes get up.
Okay, some more questions in the field, in the blue shirt in the back.
First, I'd like to thank you for the insightful presentation. My name is Leo Kim. I'm a new associate at McKinsey's DC office. So everyone is talking about the wonders of emerging economy in Asia and how they are going to make up a majority share of global economy. But in a lot of cases, once they reach a certain point, their economy seems to hit some sort of invisible barriers. So Japanese economy is in slow yet steady decline for a long time. And I'm from South Korea, and their GDP per capita has been hovering around 20,000 like for the last 10 years or so, and more or less same with Taiwan. So I'd like to hear your insight on those phenomena and whether you think China will follow the same trajectory and what they can do to avoid the same scenario.
I'm not sure we've studied that. I think it is a issue about how have countries. I mean, I think Korea is one of the few examples of countries that have managed to do it and continue doing it as well as they have. I think is one of the best examples. Most countries tend to hit a roadblock at 5,000 or 10,000 income per head and then go backwards for a bit. So I think part of the challenge is how you get that sort of that momentum. But it's not something we've studied as part of this report.
Not in this report, definitely, but I think the services sector challenge is one of all the countries that you mentioned. It's Japan, Korea, and others. Their focus has been manufacturing, which is a very important part at a certain stage of economic development when you are taking off. After certain income level, services is where almost all of GDP growth and more than all of jobs are going to come from. And that has really been a barrier to growth in Japan, in South Korea. They tend to be very supportive of industries, but services are often clamped down by regulations that don't allow scale and don't allow them to grow in the same way they have. So I think services is the single word answer to your question. And I think Singapore, for example, is very consciously trying to address that challenge.
Great. Right here.
Good morning. My name is Steve Powell, Sino Powell Capital. You said earlier that people will act in their own personal short-term self-interest. If two products are the same price, they'll buy something that's green, but if it's more expensive, they will not. And then you said that Google is building or financing solar panels in the Nevada desert. My question is, can we rely upon our form of democracy to fuel the kind of growth that we see in a place like China, when people will act and vote in only their own personal short-term self-interest?
It's an interesting one. I mean, the decision about whether you buy the right product or not, I mean, that's just the market research that tells you that, and we can argue that that's case. I think on democracy, though, I mean, again, some of you've done more than this than I have, but people often don't necessarily vote for their own interests. So, you get, the US, I think, is probably the extreme example. A lot of people who are in the don't want to, in the lower tax bands, do not want the upper tax band to increase, because even though there's a view that they might get into that category. So there's some things that aren't necessarily people voting just in their interests. So I think that's a question. I think the other issue I think your question raises is whether, as you think about the types of decision making needing to be made, is actually maybe there's more of a question of duration matching rather than necessarily people not voting their interest. And I think that the challenges, the types of issues we've been talking about today are 20 or 30 year duration issues. You need to have a 20, 30 year duration issue. Healthcare reform is a 30-year issue, to address it. The healthcare problem doesn't get really acute in many countries for 15 years. The pension problem, the government pension problem doesn't get really acute. Some of the environmental problems, we can carry on pumping carbon dioxide out. It's not really going to hit the environment for 30 years. The problem is our political system has a duration on average of 2 years, or 2.5 years, or whatever. And so we've got this difficulty of a time mismatch in terms of horizons, and that's one of the things that you can be negative on some countries that don't have democracy, but the way they've set it up is they have a longer duration. So what's Singapore's source of advantage beyond paranoia? I think it's the fact that they've got a longer-term mindset, long-term duration in terms of the way they set up their political system. You could argue the Communist Party in China has a longer-term horizon in terms of the way that they think about this than the US political system or the UK political system or the European ones. So I think that is more of the problem, is how you get the right time frame in terms of some of that.
Yeah, and I think if I jump in and I'll come back to Jana, I think it's also a problem of narrative, that Americans are, at least in the American context here, American voters are making a choice within the context of a narrative, and the narrative of 2008 was more of the same, or this hope. That was kind of how it was framed, and people chose hope, right? Hope didn't deliver in 2010, and so they chose in a different direction. Maybe these other guys will have a better idea, but part of the problem was that hope never materialized into a new narrative, and we're still talking about the global war on terror, and we're still talking about this big looming problem of deficits, right? That's the narrative that's happening in Washington right now. It's not this story. It's not the story of opportunity, of growth, of a global economy that is extraordinarily dynamic and has lots of opportunity, but it's about how we make the American dream. That narrative isn't out there, and choosing that new American dream isn't an option for in American elections, and that's, I think, where we're going to get the opportunity coming forward. It's about, but we're going to have to change that narrative, and it's going to be a narrative fight, and that's what we're seeing right now. In this government shutdown challenge, is trying to narrow the terms of that narrative. It's really a much more partisan fight. But Jana, go ahead.
I actually wanted to give a more optimistic story. I think the US government actually has done very well in cultivating new technologies. I mean, look back in the 50s, the defense expenditures, the airspace expenditures, these were really the cultivating ground for new technologies that wouldn't have existed without technology. In the 1950s, the semiconductor companies here received 70 to 80% of their revenues from government contracts or subcontracts. And this really was the source of the growth of these innovative sectors in the US. So I think it has little to do necessarily with the democracy itself. It has more to do in a way how government is using its money, and the US government is large enough that it can really make a big difference. And I think what we have seen in the recent past is the decline in R&D spent on the public sector that the private sector has been taking up, and we have seen the real crisscross in the share of public funding. But I don't think there's anything that says that the US can't be a real mover and shaper, particularly on the emerging technologies, because I think the history does tell that the nation has done very well on that. And in many cases, the industrial policies in the East have been adapting and building on what was really born in the US.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right here in the front, and then behind it. Actually, in front, and then right behind you.
Thank you very much for a good presentation. My name is Martin Bengtsson. I'm from Sweden, but working as a consultant in this town. I think you've done a great job. I'm just wondering, a thing that I'm missing in this analysis, taking it from economic power of cities into the political power of cities. You briefly alluded in the last second of the presentation on the global governance, because I'm working on a project right now looking into our cities, the new kid on the block in terms of global governance. We see a number of examples recently, like in Cancun and Copenhagen before that in the summits, where the mayors are represented, not pushing only their own national politicians, but as an international acting group, which I find very interesting. I was wondering if you could say something about that. Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think we are seeing the same thing in a way. C40 being one example. There's many other organizations where mayors are really starting to get together and play a role. And I think Richard already said about the mayors becoming more important in the national politics. We haven't done work on it, and I think we are seeing a very interesting question and interesting trends, and I think we'll be watching it closely, because I think it is definitely something where things are moving and interesting things are happening.
But it's would be a mistake to write off national politics, because things like a carbon tax, things like exchange rates, those are all determined at the national, or actually in some cases the European level. So it may be as much that as so I think this is you give the example of the whole the Cancun type things. I mean, that was hardly a governance success in terms of what was achieved.
Interesting. Okay, and then the gentleman right behind. Yep.
I'm Neil Pierce, the Washington Post Writers Group. I've been writing a column about cities since 1976.
Okay.
So it's interesting to see all of this develop over time. And then we got frustrated, myself and some colleagues, and we said it's really metropolitan regions, not cities. So we started writing reports. We did about 25 over 20 years on individual metropolitan regions and how they were developing. Then we wrote a book called City States. So I'm very pleased to see that the little idea that we had just looked back to ancient times, and you're carrying it forward with an analysis that I think is really terrific. Then we got asked by the Rockefeller Foundation to cover a global urban summit, as they called it, and Bellagio in 2007 wrote a book, Century of the City, No Time to Lose. So I think you're absolutely on the right wavelength, and we're now working on a project. We spell Cityscope with an I in the middle, and we're starting a media project to recruit journalists in cities around the world to write on innovations that should have global interest in terms of their applicability. So that's the current project, but it's raising more and more questions in my mind. The issue that you raised on creative mayors, I think is absolutely vital, but also relates to what is the expertise that is available in engineering, and planning, and all the other technical services. And certainly in some parts of the world, we get the sense the Chinese are doing that well, but sub-Saharan Africa is really way behind in this, and other areas of the world. So it's technical expertise plus the genius of political leadership that's interesting. And then what we're thinking of, it's also where is civil society pushing the mayors? In other words, when there are good ideas on how you can do urban governance more efficiently, or new ways of dealing with energy or transportation or what have you, how do you get the civil society to put the pressures on? Because frankly, when mayors meet and talk, it's all very congratulatory, and they're just expressing only the plus side of what they've done. And as a journalist, I say there's always a larger story of a struggle that you had to get there. You made it halfway, or you made it 3/4 of the way, but you have a further way to go. So those are the series of issues that are rising in my mind.
It's very good, and obviously cities, the whole concept of cities is not new, and lots of others have been doing stuff, and you go back to the Roman stuff. I think just this point about how you get innovation to happen. I think the good news is the corporate sector is waking up to the importance of cities as well. And I think that if you look at a lot of corporations, they're now trying to structure the way they put their sales teams in, the way they put their government teams in place, as much around the cities as around the central government. So I think that we will find that the large engineering companies, the planning companies, the people who build infrastructure are actually going to be doing that, and I think that will be a big source of cross-fertilization and getting the ideas in at the city level. we also have, along with some other people, played around with, should there be some city benchmarking? Could we develop a benchmark on sustainability, on work, all education, all these different components of cities? Could we use that, not in the sense of sort of giving? I mean, the risk is it becomes a stick that people beat their mayor with in terms of election time. The positive side of benchmarking is that you can say, actually, when we look at this, City X is very good at doing this, City Y isn't. City Y goes and visits City X to understand what City X has done in terms of improvement. So I'm wondering whether there's part of what could happen in terms of some of the other measures, and there are a number of organisations that are thinking about this, creating some of these benchmark information so you can actually look at which cities have done well on some of these dimensions and which haven't. Because I think that will also allow some of that cross-fertilisation to happen.
It's interesting to note on that the Bill Stafford, who heads the Trade Alliance of Greater Seattle, has been a great American internationalist, leading teams from his city around the world for the last 25 years. I've gone on trips like he's had to Hong Kong and Berlin and Sydney and so on. But he is now forming a consortium of about a dozen cities that are meeting and looking at their metropolitan comparability on a lot of sustainability and other indicators. So that's just one example of a follow or an attempt along the line you're describing.
Yeah. And part of it is to establish the right peers. So it may make more sense for Jakarta to be talking to Sao Paulo than from Jakarta to be talking to talking to another city in Indonesia.
Well, I noticed that Stafford's list had really high success, very, very professional cities that didn't have the Sao Paulos included. I think that's just right.
Yeah.
You need to do the benchmarking at different cuts across world cities.
And identify the problems as well.
Yeah. And I think on just building very much on the thought and on the comment, on the just earlier comment on the cities talking to each other, I think there's a lot of best practices to transfer. So having any rankings focus on where the good ideas are and how we can adopt them is so much better than trying to say how well I'm doing relative to everybody else. I'll give you two examples of good ideas that are actually spreading around in the cities. One of them, for example, just to take a country-specific thing, in Medellin, Colombia, they had a very close collaboration between public and private sector that provided a lot of their social services, and actually they provided a healthcare system that covered a large part of the city, part of the folks in the city, that then spread to the rest of the nation simply as a good idea. And now Bogota has the highest share of healthcare insured folks in all of Latin American largest cities. So anyway, that's just an idea of good idea spreading across the cities. Another one is, for example, transportation. The fact that the cities are stuck oftentimes with delivery trucks that have 35% of their capacity filled because every single company has their different distribution systems. Having a more thoughtful, somebody providing a docking system on different points of which they distribute full trucks into specific regions, for example, can have a noticeable impact on commute times, for example, in cities. And these are the kinds of ideas that this the latter one coming from private sector as well. So I think this definitely is something we truly believe has huge potential.
Yeah, and another example, Salt Lake City, Chris and I chronicled in our article, looks at this, or took a really interesting approach where they had not only the Chamber of Commerce, but the local conservation organizations, local farmers, local cities organizations, all coming together. 13,000 people at the end of their process were consulted and brought into workshops called charrettes to engage this question of blueprint planning. What are the values on which we want to redesign our city in the future, and how do we want to accommodate the doubling of the population that's coming? And then where do we want to lay our infrastructure, and how do we want to grow? And by providing, I think in the American context, this is going to be a real model for going forward, because you get that political buy-in from at the front end. On top of it, because it's a comprehensive blueprint for an entire metropolitan region, you move away from this challenge of gentrification, where cities urbanize or re-urbanize in a piecemeal fashion and just pushing the poverty out into the first-ring suburbs and out. So, anyways, I think there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of innovations happening, and I think having some kind of metric for understanding where it's working and where it's not, and what political context in which that's working, I think is really useful. Right behind you, Matt. Great.
Hi, my name is Sherry Garmize. I'm from the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and I actually have two questions. The first one is, one of the things I'd really like to see you dig in a little deeper in is actually what's happening to sort of poverty and disadvantaged, because how that actually expends urban resources will have an impact on the other things that they're able to do. And I know you kind of briefly looked at it, but I'd like for you to go a little bit deeper on that. And the second question, sort of feeding into the wider discussion that we're having, I'd like to sort of question one of the implications that you drew out from your analysis, and that was that the bigger companies and those that sort of package the resources had an advantage. It seems to me that the other argument could equally be made, that as you go into more middle-sized cities, and that you see, at least within the US, whether it's mayor, you see literally whole new civic infrastructures being built, both at the neighborhood and at the urban level, and a kind of willingness to innovate and experiment. It seems to me that's starting to open up and lever in spaces and new opportunities for more innovative companies that may not, that frankly are offering new opportunities that the old standards or old traditionals, which don't innovate as well as we'd like them to, some do, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so that equally, whereas some may have an advantage in some cities, in other cities they may be more open, more willing to experiment with new things. You know, for example, you know, how do you build out the grid? Well, what happens if you have technology that doesn't use a grid and that already exists out there? And so, you know, that to me, like I said, there's an implication out there that I think is deeper than just this is the advantage.
Yeah. I mean, just on the economy, I think this is actually more of an economy of scope rather than of scale. And it's, if you are selling medical devices, turbines, water plants, you can afford to have a salesperson go off and get to know the mayor of a tier 3 city. If you're a company that is just selling one of the products, you don't have that scale, scope advantage being able to do that. But I also agree, you know, the fact that we are seeing a more diffuse growth does give the advantage also to individual players, I mean small players, because you know, if it's only one buyer, you know, a small player can't necessarily build up the thing. So I think that there will be a bit of that as well. The poverty, we haven't done, you know, a huge amount on that. But I think the one bit that is worth just remembering, particularly the urbanization that's happened in China, is that has, I think, we were trying to work out the numbers the other day, that has taken more people out of poverty than we've ever had in the history of mankind. You know, you could argue that which group has delivered more poverty reduction. It's not any of these great foundations. It's not any of these sort of, you know, NGOs. It is the Urban Planning Institute of the Communist Party in China has taken more people out of poverty. So, you know, part of, you know, you can argue whether that's necessarily an interesting answer on that. But I mean, that's what's happened, is that, you know, you've effectively managed to take people out of poverty because you've taken people, you know, that 3 times income. And so that's, I think, part of the urbanization story. But you've also got to be careful. I mean, you know, if cities go wrong, you get slums, you get, you know, huge urban poverty. And urban poverty is, in many ways, a worse type of poverty. Because if you're in subsistence farming, you at least have something to eat. You know, you're not necessarily that wealthy, but it's also politically more unstable, urban poverty, because, you know, people are more likely to riot in cities than they are in rural areas.
Okay, last question right here at the maroon shirt, and we'll close it down.
My name is Paul Larson. I'm with L3 MPRI, and it actually touches on exactly what you were talking about in political instability within cities. If you look at scholarly work by people like Thomas Homer Dixon, you see that with increased urbanization, you are likely to find significant increases in instability and violent conflict. How was that incorporated into the study, and how does that change the projections on a place like China, where there is a lot of underlying instability?
Yeah, I think there are 2 points to that. First of all, I would spread the urbanization into the demographic story. So, for example, in the Middle East, what we have seen is a rapid population growth, where you have basically seen a large amount of young people coming to the labor force with no real options. So this has little to do with the urbanization process. It has to do with the demographic challenge of creating attractive jobs for a large number of young people who don't necessarily have that many options. So I think that demographics pressure is there independently, if you want, on the urbanization story. In the case of China, I think that's something you might be able to talk better into, but clearly political stability is not something we have spent a lot of time talking about.
There are lots of factors that we sort of picked up through just one or two numbers. Education, the quality of the corporates, the quality of governance, political instability. In the end, we didn't build in explicit factors into a model reflecting those. We picked up looking at differential growth rates and factors like that, which tried to capture all of those. I think that is one of the, when I started by saying the one thing about this analysis we can be sure of is wrong, is that we won't have factored in that political instability because we don't know where that's going to be. Whether it'll happen in China, whether China's going to have a stable path towards, that's a guess. Some people will have a view. Could the US go extreme in terms of Tea Party? Some people have a view on that, some people have other views. It's difficult to build that explicitly into a forecast. But I do think that the political stability issue on cities really do matter. And I think that's just back to this question about why states, foreign departments, State Department needs to worry about what's going on in cities. They need to understand what's going on in Wuhan because it's not enough any longer to just understand Shanghai and Beijing. You need to understand some of that because that's where the world may change. And if you're not close to some of these other cities and understanding some of those factors going on, suddenly you may find your complete mental model about what's going on in a country may be completely wrong.
Two points on that just to illustrate, I think, the challenge. When you look at Pakistan, Pakistan has been largely cut off from the Asian urban narrative. And in large part because of the political dysfunction, which is a function itself of a feudal land ownership system. In the context of that political that dysfunction, the urbanization story just has not taken off, and you have an enormous amount of political discontent. You have the military running the country, and I think one of the challenges for the South Asia region is how do you bring Pakistan into that larger South Asian narrative, and hook it back up with India, and have a rising tide within the entire region, which will then also kind of end a dam that has been holding back Afghanistan. But another kind of interesting correlation, at least anecdotally, between cities and conflict, when we look at where Al-Qaeda has been able to recruit suicide bombers across North Africa, it's in specific cities. It's not countries. This is really just 5 or 6 cities.
That's very interesting.
What would be really interesting to do is to look at what are the demographics, what's the economics of those cities, because my sense is that there's going to be a strong correlation between what's going on there and why these guys are ready to blow themselves up. So, I think cities are where the story is happening at the macroeconomic level, but also at the strategic level. 10 years ago, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commandant Krulak, said that Marines are going to be increasingly operating in an urban environment, and that's what they need to prepare for, because they knew 2007 we crossed the 50% threshold of people living in the cities, and I think that's just to wrap it up here. How this story proceeds, I think, is really going to be the story of the quality of prosperity and security in the future, and getting this right, I think, is really going to be important. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Richard and Jana, for the great presentation. Thanks to McKinsey.